anyone who wants to study biology, there are a few questions, well, really only one, that they must attempt to answer. This question is essentially unanswerable. Now, even though it is unanswerable, biologists still spend their time doing their best to answer it, and yes, there is a formal definition as to what life is, otherwise viruses would be considered to be alive, which, by the way, they are not, even though they can cause diseases in living organisms. So obviously there is a definition, but we're not exactly looking for the definition so much as what makes it obvious to even a small child that a rock is not alive, unless of course it's a cleverly disguised organism like these rock plants or stone plants. But a child knows that a piece of grass or a slug or say a dog is alive. Now, ever since time immemorial, ever since before man as we know him has had breath, people, or well, the ancestors of modern humans, have, while doing something else, like say chipping away at a rock to make a stone arrowhead or something, they have thought of what does it mean for something to be alive. Now, most likely, they tended to think of it as being edible or being able to grow on its own or something similar to that. Why edible? Well, when man's struggle was with nature, he would not know how he might eat. By the way, that's why humans have this habit of looking to eat fatty foods. Why? Because fats contain the largest amount of energy per unit mass. So you can only cram so much food down your throat. You might as well do it in fats and, well, if available, proteins, because proteins are needed to build, say, muscle and repair damage. Of course, other stuff like vitamins and minerals and such are also needed, hence why we have the ability to taste acidity. Mostly, it is used to detect the presence of vitamins. They're called vitamins because they are vital. The etymology there doesn't sound all that complicated, right? So stuff like vitamin C, which is needed to build collagen. Lack of vitamin C eventually leads to scurvy, which involves deterioration of the connective tissues of the body, especially noticeably the gums. Now, admittedly, I don't have the best teeth because I didn't feel like getting braces, but hey, the point remains. Now, of course, later on, much later, after the first person who asked what is life, there was somebody who was like, what is love? And of course, the answer was something like A, your baby not hurting you anymore. B, a battlefield. C, blind, and so on. Now, this question is unimaginably more complicated. But let's try to talk about some things that we can observe in life. Now, we do point out that in this picture, which is from the Cologne University Botanical Collection, admittedly, the camouflage here of these stone plants could use a little bit of work. Now, these plants are actually mostly underground. These little pieces of extended leaf out here, they're out here to let light in underground where most of the photosynthesis happens. This is an adaptation to basically deal with the arid climates that they tend to live in. Now, they don't do quite so well as certain other plants in some other environments. Amusingly, some areas where you can find these stone plants or pebble plants might even get 700 millimeters of rain a year. By the way, 200 millimeters of rain a year is already enough to grow millet. So 700 is pretty much rainforest. Now, 700 millimeters of rain a year sounds like a lot, right? So how is it that they're not outcompeted by plants that are adapted to wet environments? Well, it's probably a matter of herbivory. So animals browsing around around the ground looking for food to eat thinks it's a pebble, so they don't eat it. Whereas other plants that are better adapted for wet environments might not have effective camouflage comparable to this. Of course, the fact that they're all growing in a clump kind of ruins the camouflage, but if you occasionally see a funny colored pebble, well, say this one, this little one down here. That is almost certainly a stone plant. And I say almost certainly because it is possible for a natural pebble to have coloration somewhat like that. So we see that often life takes the form of non-life to stay alive. But once we observe them over a little bit of time, we see that they're very distinct from non-life. In that, well, obviously they grew. So these big things grew up from little things. What other traits might life have? Well, life tends to be well organized. For example, one thing you can observe that's most likely very well organized is, say, the eye. Looking in the mirror will show you that the eye is a very organized structure. Of course, looking too closely is not recommended for health reasons. So stuff like, oh, the hand, limbs. Limbs are very organized things. We notice that our limbs all have the same arrangement of 2 bones in the lower limb and 1 bone in the upper limb. We also notice that at least in humans we have 5 digits per limb. Other animals will differ in digits per limb, but within a particular type of animal, the digit count is consistent. That means that these are developmentally very organized. Now, another example of order might be a chrysanthemum. Chrysanthemum. This is a type of flower. Depending on the specific type you are looking at, it may or may not look very much like a dandelion. Oh, by the way, dandelions are also very, very organized. You will notice that they all radiate out in a fairly consistent pattern from a central point. And of course, depending on what environmental stresses they are undergoing, such as frequent mowing, or, well, not so frequent mowing, or lots of water, they will vary. Dandelions can form relatively puffy, almost tiny little bush-like things, although they are not woody. They are herbaceous. So they can grow to be quite tall. But they can also lie almost completely flat on the ground. This depends on the stress of frequent mowing or not. This is a matter of developmental plasticity. This is not a matter of evolution. Especially because in eastern North America, there is an estimated total of about 3 dandelion plants. The rest are all clones of these 3. So the flowers that we see for dandelions, they don't actually work. Even though they are obviously still very, very organized, they actually still produce pollen even, but they don't actually get fertilized. Because all those little seeds that you see, well, they're not really seeds. We call them seeds, but they also act like seeds, but that's all maternal tissue. So there is no fertilization involved, there is no crossover between genes. Well, it is not sexual reproduction, it is asexual reproduction. Still, dandelion flowers are very organized. The smaller chrysanthemums tend to strongly resemble them. The larger chrysanthemums would be, well, first of all, they're huge. Second, they have many, many, many additional layers of petals. And of course, say roses. The modern rose, as we know it from, say, flower shops, that thing is an abomination compared to how roses started out in the wild. In fact, most ornamental plants nowadays are a little bit iffy compared to what they're like in the wild. There are, of course, exceptions. For example, tulips. Well, wild tulips look basically the same. There are also other plants that we know are very ordered. Let's think of some. Pine cones. Pines are gymnosperms, so their seeds do not have a fruit around the outside. It may interest you to know that wheat is an angiosperm. It has fruit. You might be thinking, hey, whoa, stop. All these cereal grains, when we eat them, it's just a seed. Where is the fruit? I mean, we know that you can take a piece of wheat, like a head of wheat, and you can peel it and then eat the seeds raw. So where is the fruit? Well, actually, the fruit of, say, wheat is fused with the seed coat. So that's a simple dry fruit. But it is still a fruit because there is a specific structure that is formed by the ovary. So, what else can we think of that might be a highly organized plant structure? Well, corn cobs are very organized. Potatoes are very organized, even though they might seem kind of haphazard with their shape. And the fact that all the eyes tend to be not so regularly spaced. The fact is, in potatoes, you will not see two eyes that are growing too closely together. Why is this? It's because of various chemical signals that prevent that from happening. Now, what about other highly organized structures that are found in, say, animals instead of just plants? Well, in animals, limbs, as we previously mentioned, body plans. Plants don't have body plans, really. What else? Well, movement is actually a very organized thing. So the nervous system coordinates movement, and we notice that all members of a particular species will move in approximately the same general forms, due to bodily limitations mostly. So, organ systems such as the nervous system, or digestive system, or whatever else. Now, let's get down to a lower level than just organism as in general. Well, there's also cells, the basic building unit of life, as we consider it to be life. So this is much of why viruses are not considered life. Prions are also not considered life because they can't reproduce on their own, they must receive assistance. Even though prions do cause disease in living organisms. Alright, so life also has this habit of regulating its internal environment, so to suit its needs. We know that cells have an ion concentration that is very, very different from the outside solution. Well, modern cells. So, for example, sodium. In human cells, the sodium concentration is very low compared to the concentration in the interstitial fluid and in blood. This is part of what allows the sodium-potassium pump to build up such a gradient. The other part is the concentration of potassium inside the cell, so that, say, nerve impulses can be conducted. Now, this is not just in humans. Anything that has nerves uses basically the same sodium-potassium mechanism to move around. Well, to move signals around, to be more specific. Now, here we see the result of life not just regulating itself. it also regulates its external environment. So whether intentional or unintentional, why is this both? This big boulder, well, okay, actually it's not that big, but this big rock is sitting in the National Museum of Mineralogy and Geology in Dresden, Germany. What does this rock actually do? What does it actually show? This is a banded iron formation. So all these red bands you see here, that's oxidized iron. Now, banded iron formations are responsible for most of the iron ore that humans mine from the earth. When were they laid down? Why is it in all these neat layers? That's because this was laid down during the Great Oxygenation event. Now, this event was when the concentration of oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere began to increase from trace amounts up to a decent fraction of modern day levels, where it remained for quite a while before it shot up later on. So this is both an unintentional effect of life in terms of cyanobacteria and other early photosynthetic organisms releasing oxygen and conducting photosynthesis. Please note that for photosynthetic organisms that release oxygen, oxygen is a waste product, but it is not toxic in low concentrations. Obligate anaerobic organisms, on the other hand, oxygen is highly reactive. It will attack their cell walls, it will attack their proteins, it will attack them in general, which means that it is toxic to them. Why is it that cyanobacteria do not take oxygen to be a toxin so readily? It's because they're pumping out oxygen all the time. If it was toxic, if they didn't have adaptations to deal with that oxygen, to tolerate that oxygen, they would die, like just by photosynthesizing. Which obviously is not the case, because the photosynthesizers are still around, such as cyanobacteria. Now, this is unintentional in the form of the release of oxygen. This is also quite intentional because this boulder, as you can probably tell, was not just sitting here originally. It had to be moved by humans. So clearly, humans have regulated their external environment by moving this boulder to the museum. All right. Other examples of humans regulating their external environment intentionally include, say, every single human settlement, every single human-built structure, every single human-made tool. In a sense, these are all means of regulating our external environment to be more friendly to us intentionally. Unintentionally, or less intentionally, on the other hand, we have the problem of, say, increasing pollution due to our consumption of goods and services. This pollution is an unintentional effect of us on the environment. Cannot exactly be said to be regulate per se, but, well, it's something we're doing to the world, which is less than pleasant. Now, energy. Okay, obviously, creatures, animals, plants, whatever. So living things in general, even bacteria, because they swim around, for example, or alternatively, they grow and then they divide. So even microbes need energy to live. So to live, they get their energy either from inorganic sources such as light, or they can get it from chemicals that are not organic, or they can get it from organic chemicals, such as sugars. Well, say glucose. You've probably done glycolysis and the citric acid cycle and so on before, right? So that's a means of extracting energy from glucose or other carbon skeletons. For example, amino acids can be modified / degraded into forms that allow for use as carbon backbones in the citric acid cycle or in other anabolic processes. So say you have too much of one amino acid, you need to convert it to another amino acid. Well, that's anabolism and catabolism put together. So catabolism is considered to be breaking stuff down. Anabolism is to build things up, like make new proteins, versus catabolism is digesting proteins. Now this energy processing is done at a cellular level. It's also done at a subcellular level in terms of, say, glycolysis. And, well, we also do energy processing in terms of, say, digestive system. And of course, the musculoskeletal system, nervous system, and so on consume energy. So really, energy processing could probably be lumped in with nutrient processing. But technically, that would also be part of, say, regulating one's environment. Why? Because by obtaining nutrients, we can keep our internal environment in balance. Alright, so if life just existed and did not replicate itself, eventually it dies, and that form of life will no longer be observed. Therefore, reproduction is an essential function of life. All life will reproduce to make more of their own kind, which carries to some degree or another their own genes. Now, some creatures reproduce directly, for example, a queen bee laying eggs. Some creatures increase their own reproductive output indirectly, for example, a worker bee helping the queen so that she can lay more eggs. It is actually more profitable for a queen to lay eggs, as long as she only mated with one male, than the worker bee going off to lay her own eggs. Now, why is this the case? Well, eusocial insects follow usually an XO, or rather, in their particular case, a matter of diploid, female, haploid, male. So, as long as the queen only mated with one male, then all of the daughters, all the workers, will be aware, well, not aware per se, they don't actually know. It's just that this behavior of being workers is enforced by the fact that each egg the queen lays has 75% genetic resemblance to that worker. So, in other words, the share from the mother, half of it is, on average, is identical to the workers. But the share from the father is completely identical to what the worker already has. So for every new female larva that is raised, the worker's fitness is 75% of that larva. Whereas having a larva herself, the worker would only get, well, half their genes passed on. Now this is most likely what led to the evolution of eusociality. Social insects. Although a queen laying eggs only passes on 50% of her genes per egg. Eusocial insects, so 50% for a queen laying eggs, 75% for workers per female egg, or 100% for workers, for workers tending the queen's male offspring. Why? Because we know that haploids, i.e. the queen is laying an unfertilized egg, all of it having her own genetic information, would be 100% the queen's genetic information. Wait a second. What about the workers that tend to that egg? How much of their genetic information is in that male? Well, we know that none of the genetic information from the father, that 50% that's identical between all workers, is in the male. So the other part, the haploid chromosome set that the male gets, that's on average likely only equivalent to 25% of the worker. So 25%. Now, most other organisms tend toward the 50%. So eusocial insects are a bit of a special case in this one. But we still had to put it in because they're carrying their genes. We must note that it's to varying degrees. Now, we know that in terms of reproduction, always able to reproduce more than replacement. Reproduce more than replacement. The current human population problem is basically that there are too many people who are trying to consume too much in terms of goods and services for the earth to support our demand, or to support this many people all living to an industrialized nation's living standards. So we want to reduce the number of people that are born. This is a better way of controlling the population, at least morally speaking, than to fight wars or otherwise get the population down, one way or another. So, we know that all organisms can have many, many more offspring than is needed to replace the parents, or parent, as is the case. Like, say, bacteria. You have one parent reproducing asexually. Now, what does it mean that the earth is not covered in, well, any type of organism? Like, say, elephants. Elephants reproduce extremely slowly, but they are still more than enough that one pair of elephants can have many more than two offspring, i.e. one to replace each of them. So, clearly, something has to be at work here. Some of the offspring survive, some do not. Or in the wild, most offspring do not survive. So what is it that differentiates the ones that do survive from the ones that don't? Well, it has to be the case that the surviving offspring, on average, because there is always a chance of a particularly well-adapted creature having a tree fall over on it. So, on average, the offspring that survive and reproduce successfully are the ones that are most capable of surviving and reproducing in that particular environment. Now, the environment can change over time, which is why sometimes the frequency of particular phenotypes, appearances, which tend to be correlated to genotype, i.e. genes, will vary over time. For example, there is a type of lizard. This type of lizard has orange-throated males, blue-throated males, and yellow-throated males. So the orange-throated males are the most aggressive, the blue-throated males are moderately aggressive, and the yellow throats pretend to be females to sneak in and get mates. So, when the orange throats dominate, the yellow throats can sneak past them successfully and mate with females. So then the number of yellow-throated males in the next generation increases. And the orange throat's fitness, i.e. ability to compete and so on, and, well, technically speaking, fitness is more ability to leave offspring that can reproduce. So the orange throat's fitness takes a dive because the yellow throat snuck past and mated with all the females that they were trying to guard or trying to hog to themselves. The blue-throated males are at an advantage when there are lots of yellow throats because while yellow throats are sneaky, they can't defend territories. So the blue throats can defend small territories with a few females safely. So they can successfully defend these against the yellow throats. But then the orange throats get more successful because they can push out the blue throats because they're more aggressive and better fighters. And then the sneaky ones become better again because the number of orange throats has increased and therefore the yellow throats are better able to get at the females. So this cycle, well, perpetuates itself. Hence why it is important to note that it's most able to survive and reproduce in the current environment. Many organisms have managed to evolve themselves into dead ends by dint of this mechanism. Evolution does not plan ahead, which is a bit of a problem. Human biological evolution has more or less been at a standstill for quite a while. And for the most part, it has been cultural evolution that has driven humanity forward. This cultural evolution also does not exactly look forward as much as, well, in hindsight, we might probably like. But the point remains that while cultural evolution is an important part of human history, for biology study purposes, we won't get to it until the ecology unit, most likely. Alright, response to the environment. Okay, clearly, when an organism receives a stimulus from an environment, in other words, say, hey guys, there's a fire over there, or something similar to that, well, it has to do something, right? It has to be able to react. Or, hey, I think I see something coming. Might be dangerous. Let's hide. Right? So, obviously, the stimuli has to generate a response. And in higher level organisms with nervous systems, we might have, say, the nervous system and the musculoskeletal system working together to conduct this response. Now, of course, there are also other organ systems involved, such as the endocrine system, hence the term adrenaline rush. What other responses are there to the environment? Well, in organisms that don't have a nervous system, they still respond to the environment, like an amoeba. It can chase after a bacterium, or a white blood cell can chase after a bacterium. So these follow chemical signals. So chemicals are shed by the bacterium. So this is chemotaxis. How does chemotaxis occur? Well, it depends on differential receptor stimulation on different sides of the organism. So when it detects a stimulus here, what it does is essentially send its cytoskeleton to quickly construct a network and push that way, while pulling the back of the cytoskeleton along by turning it into a mostly liquefied form and thus, well, pushing through, basically. Now, growth, development, and repair. Okay, so organisms tend to begin small, and then they tend to grow up. Of course, depending on the organism, this may be, just after mitosis and cytokinesis, a cell is relatively small, it has to undergo a growth phase before it can synthesize new DNA, and then it has to undergo another growth phase after that, where it replicates its organelles and so on, and then it can divide. Or for a multicellular organism, this growth and development can take a very long time and finish after sexual maturity, i.e. the ability to reproduce, comes along. Now, reproduction, understandably, interferes greatly with growth and development. This affects the size of, say, human females, Ones that reproduce earlier tend to end up smaller as adults, and thus reproduction is riskier for them. And well, okay, in addition to growth and development, there are also other processes, such as repair. Now, various organisms can repair themselves to varying degrees. So say an amoeba. If you take off one pseudopod, provided the amoeba is healthy, then usually the amoeba tends to be able to recover depending on the size of the pseudopod and the size of the injury, so to speak. Now, if you take off, well, a limb from, say, a lobster, it's not too rare to see crabs or lobsters at market minus one limb or more. On the other hand, a human can only regenerate, say, a finger, depending on circumstances. And even that requires that it be, say, a small child who can potentially regenerate a finger, depending on conditions. For the most part, humans are not very good at regeneration compared to, say, starfish or geckos. Geckos can drop their tail to distract predators and run. Now, what about plants? Well, plants also undergo growth and development, but their cells, unlike animal cells, tend to not divide after they are mature, or after the particular cells are mature. At the meristems, apical or lateral, cell division still continues and adds more functioning cells to the plant. As for repair, well, cell repair pretty much goes as a matter of, hey, revert back to a less differentiated state and divide. Of course, some specialized cells are dead at maturity and thus cannot do this. So they depend on other companion cells, for example, to actually do any repairs that might be needed. Alright, so in this chapter, we will first focus on the general concepts that are apparent at every level of biology, for example, emergent properties. A pile of rocks is a pile of rocks. A pile of chemicals put together to make a cell, it does a lot more than those chemicals alone can do. So we will also make note of the basis of biology as a science, namely evolution. Why is it the basis of biology as a science? Well, it's a matter of, hey guys, how does this pathway work? Why does it act like this? Why isn't it more efficient? It's because evolutionary history has railroaded the development, pretty much, into that particular route. Or that chemical pathway is a relic of evolutionary development, and there have been no mutations that have provided a more advantageous pathway, or at least no mutations that are compatible with existing pathways in other parts of the cell or other particular reactions that occur in the same space. Alright, next, well, we will talk about scientific inquiry. In other words, how do scientists ask questions? What sort of questions do they ask? i.e., questions that you can actually test instead of the theory that the universe is run by invisible magical unicorns. It may well be, but that is not testable, and therefore we do not consider it scientifically valid. Alright. Finally, we will discuss the general culture of science and its effects on society. So science has a culture. Cultural evolution is interesting in the fact that the scientific process is actually a very unnatural process as far as human culture has mostly been concerned. Why? Because, well, culturally speaking, the most sensible thing is to listen to what the chief says and listen to what the elders say. Oh, they must be right. Okay, they pass down knowledge. Great. Whereas scientific process is basically test it a different way, test it another way, try to draw a conclusion from the tests that you do, or from the reliable test data that you have from other people. Of course, whether or not this test data is actually reliable, whether or not they've actually covered all the angles that they need to consider, Well, that might be questionable, but still that's questionable in a scientifically consistent way, in the form of you can go and test for those variables that you think might be a problem. So the general culture of science, it has been very important for human cultural evolution, from basically blind obedience of the elders to a matter of, if I have seen farther, then yes, I have stood on the shoulders of giants, but even if I'm standing on the shoulder of giants, I still have to actually go turn my head around correctly and take a look, right? That's the part that Newton didn't say. The fact that even, sure, okay, standing on the shoulders of giants, or alternatively by modern interpretation, standing on the shoulders of everyone who came before. Yeah, great, okay, you're up high. If your eyes are shut, and you simply refuse to see, or hear, or whatever, that's completely useless. So, no matter what, the scientific culture is an important thing that we must talk about. So that's it for this introduction to the introduction, section 1.0, which you will not find in a text. You will find it as overview of chapter 1. So that's it, and we'll see each other again next section.